Before I get started, I want to thank everyone who made this research project possible. First and foremost, Melody and Andrea for their support. And of course, my partners in the country, Jimena Gallegos and Mariana Huila, who were located at the university I worked at and who guided me at that institution and in Mexico City at large. And of course, my host throughout Mexico, Miguel Ubalde, who has helped students in this project in the past, and who is even more energetic than me at about 70 years old. So my host institution in Mexico was La Universidad Iberoamericana. It is a private Jesuit university founded in 1943 and located on the outskirts of Mexico City. It offers both undergraduate and graduate programs, and it also has a division called Incidencia, which is difficult to translate but has something to do with external impact. Ibero's Incidencia program includes 5 separate subdivisions that focus on the university's impact in 5 separate social issues in Mexico. Of these 5, I worked with the Migration Issues program, or PRAMI, discussing the topic of migration. So when I began planning this project and decided to participate, I knew that I wanted to work on migration in the context of education and social justice. It's a topic that's been really interesting to me. It's a topic that I've worked on from sort of a standpoint of the US and migrants coming to the US, migrants living in the US. So I knew it was of interest. I knew I wanted to get the Mexican view on the subject, but at the same time I thought that probably what I had learned about migration, what I knew about the immigrant experience, probably stood up in Mexico, probably was pretty similar. But when I arrived, I realized and was told pretty quickly that the context for work in migration is very different in Mexico than it is in the United States, for many reasons. But the defining reason is really government and civil society. So Mexico's relationship to their government and the role of civil society in work like migration. So in the United States, at least from my perspective, when we talk about immigration, we talk about the government. We talk about passing legislation for comprehensive immigration reform or not passing it. We talk about who we're going to elect president. We talk about the government's security and the government's walls and the government's detention centers. But in Mexico, I was told early on and discovered very quickly that the perspective is totally different. I think this quote captures it. This is from Javier Urbano, a professor at Ibero. He says, in the end, the only thing you're going to see here in Mexico is that though we have 70 shelters, soup kitchens, detention centers, all sorts of humanitarian response to migration, all of this is civil society. It's not the government. Mexico has this massive network, but the government doesn't do that work. It's really civil society practitioners. So with this in mind, I realized that I needed to shift my perspective, and I created my research questions accordingly, sort of on the spot, which were, first, what are the experiences of current civil society practitioners working on migration issues in Mexico? And secondly, how is higher education responding to these issues, both by addressing the problem directly as an institution, and also by preparing students to address the problem in their future work? Not even the problem, the challenges. So to find out, I conducted 30 interviews with as broad a range of perspectives as I could get, focusing generally in the world of academia, so professors, students, university staff, but also separately in the larger world of civil society in Mexico, so NGOs, direct service providers, also some international organizations. Before I tell you what I found, it's worth taking a moment to talk about what exactly Central American migration in Mexico means. As we're all aware, there's not very much time for each of these presentations, so I can't go into that or do that justice. But in short, Mexico has a much more complicated relationship to migration than I think we typically imagine from our vantage point in the United States. When you think about Mexico and you think about migration, you think of them as a sending country, a country that sends immigrants across our borders, whether documented or undocumented, daily, yearly. But in fact, Mexico has a much more complicated relationship with the issue. Mexico is a country, a sending country, but it's also a receiving country where migrants come with the intention of settling. And it's also a country of transit, where someone from Latin America or even from Africa, or places you wouldn't expect, come through with the intention of settling somewhere else. Of these identities, I chose to focus on Central American migration in particular, so Mexico is a country of transit for Central American migrants. And that's because that's a really salient issue and a really understudied issue. For decades, Central America has seen a great deal of violence, which is continuously pushing refugees out of those countries, and more often than not through Mexico or to Mexico, in search of a life that doesn't include systematic violence and government instability and persecution, which they experience on a regular basis. So how has Mexican higher education traditionally responded to this issue, to the issue of migration in their country? One consideration is the resources and power that a university has. So a university like Ibero, a private university, necessarily has funding, staff, reputation, and the power to use those things. But historically, they have not necessarily been put to use in the realm of social issues like migration. Universities also, of course, have undergraduate programs, licenciaturas, but typically in the Mexican model, it's not quite what we would expect coming from somewhere like Georgetown or from a US institution. More often than not, students enter with their career, is pretty much the direct translation, their major established, and they take predetermined courses in that subject every semester, almost exclusively, without much interdisciplinary work or without the possibility of sort of crossing into other disciplines. Additionally, Mexican universities traditionally have what I mentioned before, an incidencia department. The efforts that incidencia staff make are primarily to use the resources of the university to focus on social issues. However, historically, such programs have staff members who aren't necessarily directly involved and often are completely disconnected from undergraduate programs. So this is really an exciting branch of the university, but it doesn't connect to education, and it's, for that reason, not fully utilized. So given that context, how does this relate to, and how does this traditional education paradigm line up with the realities of working on migration issues in the field in Mexico? Many of my interviewees in civil society tended to focus on a few topics when discussing their experience. Whether I asked them or not, they would tell me why they were interested in the topic and what inspired them to do the work that they did. Sometimes they referenced an academic experience, but unanimously they brought up some real-life, concrete interaction with the issue. So something that you can't necessarily get in a traditional classroom, a conversation with a migrant, a visit to a shelter, an internship. Practitioners also describe the difficulty of moving from an academic setting to field work or to practicing work in the issue area. The narrow perspective and sometimes limited skill set that a university traditionally offers doesn't always correspond with the multifaceted, challenging work that you have to do in the field. And finally, conversations often turned to how practitioners keep their spirits up in the field, especially one that involves such a constant onslaught of just ongoing suffering and challenges that you feel like you're just filling in the gaps, but you're not really making anything more than a cosmetic change. One individual expressed that experience and that challenge particularly well, Adriana Salcedo, who graduated as an undergraduate from Ibero and now, among other things, works in their research development branch. So I can't read this all, but she says, after hearing so many things and seeing so much, you ask yourself, how can I not cry? How can I continue believing in the people of this world? And these are the big challenges. This was a common theme. It was hard to have a conversation without, by the end, being so overcome by what people were doing that you had to ask, how do you deal with this? How do you keep working in this field? So as you may or may not be able to tell, the experience of being a civil society practitioner, excluding the university zone, is not necessarily aligned with the experience of studying or trying to study migration in a university in Mexico. And so is that hopeless? Is the traditional paradigm for education and higher education all we have? Not necessarily, and definitely not at Ibero. So many professors and students talk to me about a number of new initiatives at the university, most of them actually starting in this past year or this current academic year, that fill in these gaps and connect to the needs expressed by civil society practitioners to a much greater extent than ever before. So a few of these examples are a new type of class. This year, Ibero is offering a clinic to undergraduate law students. That's actually an undergraduate degree in Mexico, where those who are interested and apply can actually work on refugees' cases, pushing them through the legal system in Mexico in an astonishingly real-world and practical way. Ibero is also starting a master's in migration. The first class will graduate I guess, a year after this academic year. And the director of this program is actually Javier Urbano, who you saw a quote from at the beginning. And he emphasizes to a really unusual degree in Mexico fieldwork and concrete interaction with migrants. The fact that you can read a book about an issue, but if you leave the classroom after 2 years of reading a book, you are really not going to be able to do the work that you need to do. And finally, recent efforts on the part of Ibero's Migration Issues program, so that's one of the Incidencia programs, are really trying to connect their work to students' work. So there are classes where architecture students, instead of studying theory, are actually called on to design an ideal migrant shelter, or where a psych student, instead of reading a textbook, really talks to migrants or interacts with the concept of psychology and migration, how that interacts. So while traditional education tends to fall short, that doesn't mean that the higher education sphere can never correspond to the civil society sphere. And in Mexico, even today, people and institutions are making changes that make those two worlds align better and prepare people like ourselves to do work in the world. So thank you.